Why work on it? What's interesting?
So I think for quite a long time now, right, there have been a collection of these related movements that basically all have to do with this question of can we also innovate at the very lowest levels of governance, right? And so that includes jurisdictions and law. It also includes physical infrastructure, and like we've seen, the free cities movement, and there's an entire spectrum of sort of how normal versus I guess how radical different things are. Like you had people just talking about making basically new developments based on the latest urban design principles on the other side of an airport, and then all the way on the other side, you had people who just wanted to live in massive cruise ships together to avoid the U.S. government, right? And there's an entire spectrum of this in between, and I think it's always attracted different people for a combination of different motivations, right? So one of them is the desire to get past the limitations of existing jurisdictions and legal systems. One of them is just this idea that there's a lot of this basically the equivalent of technical debt behind these very ancient systems, and that includes legal, and that also includes just physical infrastructure, like how cities are built. And if you can start from scratch, then we can do a lot of things based on all of the knowledge that we've accrued over the last century in observing successes and failures and all of the different strands of urbanism. We've seen people thinking about building cities, thinking about building jurisdictions, also thinking about ways to try to combine that with other technologies, right? So I wrote an article in 2021 on crypto cities, talking about ideas for how a crypto technology could be used inside of a city for governance. So these ideas have existed for a long time, and I think if your goal is to create a more free and open and efficient society and economy, then it's a very natural strategy to try to look into and explore. And in 2022, Balaji wrote this book on network states, and it was fascinating. I wrote a big, long review of it. I thought there was a lot of interesting bits, though at the same time, one of the fascinating things is how it combines a lot of network state theory together with sort of big picture Balajian vision of what's wrong with the world and what needs to change and what could be right with it. And it's always interesting how different characters have their own very specific different focuses, very different object level of reasons why they're not satisfied with the status quo that drive them to be interested in these kinds of alternatives. And so at the time, I basically noticed that there's a lot of people talking about these themes, and it felt to me intuitively like there could be something that's really valuable there. And I decided to basically just go and do an experiment, and this was Zulu, right? Bring 200 people together from Ethereum and a couple of other spaces, be in one place in Montenegro, basically just try to actually be a city for 2 months. And a lot of people enjoyed the experiment, but at the same time, it was less clear what the actual next step is and where to go from there. And so I see all of these continuations of, including Aleph itself as being answers to that question, right? And you can see how these answers end up going into different directions, right? Some of them are trying to create new cities from scratch. Some of them are creating things right in the middle of existing cities. Some of them are in small countries. Some of them are in large countries. Some of them are in countries that are realistically doing quite well. Some of them are in countries that are just starting some basic stages of economic development. Some of them have needs that are more jurisdictional. Some of them are more interested in better urbanism or even just reducing costs for people. So it's I think to me the fundamental thing that they have in common is this idea that the bottom level of physical infrastructure is something where we can innovate and improve. and where there's a goal of trying to use our ability to come together and coordinate and build communities and coordinate over the internet to get past the network effect barriers that often keep people stuck in bad locations even when there are better ones. And like we try to like basically really create that those new points for people to get to gather around and like actually push forward something, whether it's a new type of city or a new type of jurisdiction or just a new type of university.
Yeah. You mentioned changing things that, or finding pathways for things that are not possible to do currently. As one of the things that maybe motivates us as folks. I know that you care about that sort of thing. What are the kinds of things that today you see the world rate limited on, like that you can't really innovate on in certain areas, or the friction is too high?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so talking about physical infrastructure, I mean, like, yeah, I think, governance is like one of those incredibly big categories, right? Like, governance can mean governance of, like, jurisdictions, it can mean governance of blockchains, it can mean governance of virtual worlds, but basically, like creating large-scale, like rules for large-scale interaction, including rules for changing those rules, and like actually trying out those systems and like testing different approaches and actually seeing what works. That's like this is one of those spaces where I think like the network state space and crypto are like really have like everything in common, right? And like within Ethereum, I mean, I think blockchains themselves are like a really fascinating experiment, right? Because if you think about the process for how you change the rules of a blockchain, there's hard forking, and then Bitcoin there's soft forking, and then it's this weird game where like the bottom level of the game is basically you have chains, people who agree on the rules are on the same chain, and if people disagree, they can fork. And at some point you change the rules, but then each individual person has to agree on the new rules, and if they don't agree, then there's a fork. But then on top of that, there's like structures on top of structures that try to encourage people to actually stay on the same rules as each other, and at the same time to make sure that those rules don't change in ways that violate people's expectations in certain ways. So like in Bitcoin, not violating the 21 million limit, in Ethereum, but also not arbitrarily printing coins, also not arbitrarily breaking people's applications. And like earlier, there's a lot of these different rules, right? With like different levels of strength to them, right? So like some people in Bitcoin think that proof of work is just as fundamental to like what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin as a 21 million limit, and some people don't really care as much, right? So there's like all of these really complicated structures, and blockchains are this weird thing that's like somewhere in the middle between being an open source project, a nation, a company, and a religion. It's like they have a quarter of each of those, right? And like we actually learn and discover like really interesting different things, and like a lot of different patterns for how to do governance, including decision making and including communication, and then we get to apply them to other places, right? But generally, like the number of these kinds of experiments that we're doing, especially at like a proper enough like scale and level of realism that the answers are relevant, is like very small, right? And one of the impetuses to me of the whole network state movement is like we can create communities that are excited about participating in these experiments, and then like actually try out a lot of different things at 200-person scale, a scale significant enough that you actually have like real challenges and problems, but also small enough that it's manageable and you can do a lot of them, and then like we get to see what happens and learn from them.
And when you think about governance, and you mentioned printing, I think everybody here is very familiar with what happens when you just rampantly print. There's these opportunities in macroeconomy design, where like when you think about all of the people in the world, everyone is heavily subject to the macroeconomic conditions in their environment, and in a huge way, the governments and industry of that location just has a huge impact in their ability to do things. How do you think about ways in which we can improve the economic structure for society at large through crypto? Like, what are the kinds of things that we should be exploring, experimenting with, and so on? Maybe in the smaller scale to then, pioneer the large scale.
Yeah. So I think you need two specific categories that kind of go beyond the simple one of just making like payments and savings and financial tools accessible to people, which I think is really important, that I've recently been following. So one of them is this category that I call info finance, which is basically it's an extension of prediction markets, but generally the idea that you can use markets to motivate people to provide information about like facts that people want to know as low a cost as possible and as quickly as possible. And with prediction markets, I think in the last year we actually saw how they can be an effective addition to people's process of learning things about the world as they happen, right? So whether it's elections or other kinds of events happening in the world, like business, science, there's a lot of situations where, like, for me personally, the first thing I would do is I would go and like check polling market, and then if prices make a movement, then I would go and like read the news and check why, right? And the combination of the two together is like actually more powerful than either one by itself. And to me, this is interesting because I think social media has a problem that like the mechanisms don't inherently do a good job of favoring truth over falsehood, right? They favor like virality and various other things that are optimized by fairly inscrutable algorithms. And if you want to tell, and then the challenge is that the thing that a lot of people reach for by default if they want to solve this problem is saying like, hey, let's appoint a particular group of experts, they decide what the truths are, they decide what the falsehoods are, and then you like boost the truths and like down boost the falsehoods and problem solved, right? Sorry, but then you do that with falsehoods. So the problem is, of course, that like one man's disinformation is another man's unfairly maligned valid point, and so you do things like that, and I always just end up alienating a huge mass of people, and like I think that's exactly what we saw happen in reality the last few years. And the question is, can we create rules that favor truth over falsehood in ways that don't do that by making reference to a particular group of people that's supposed to know ahead of time what the truths are, right? And prediction markets are one of those answers, right? Because what they do is they basically say, okay, well, any people can go and make bets on what will happen, and then later on we all know what actually happened, and then people who bet correctly make money, people who bet incorrectly lose money, and so the quality of the participants goes up over time, and they have an incentive to give the best answer they can, right? And and then I think prediction markets are not the only example. Like community notes is one example of something that I've been very happy to see. But can we make 10 more things like that, right? So like that's info finance. And then another one is funding public goods, right? And funding public, basically, there's just a lot of things that human civilization depends on, but I think especially like internet communities, like crypto communities, depend on even more because everything is virtual. Where these things are things that provide a lot of value, but they're also like inherently things that are very difficult to charge for, right? Like ideas of software, they're open. If it's open, then anyone can just go and use it, and that itself makes it much harder to charge for it, right? Then the question is, well, how do we actually fund these things? And in particular, even if you have your pool of funding, how do you set up rules to choose which things to fund in such a way that those rules don't get like corrupted and exploited over time, right? So, if you have a grants body, then like that grants body can become corrupted. We've tried quadratic funding, which is this like very economically beautiful, interesting idea, and that's like basically using a form of donation matching that's uses the number of people that donated as a signal of how public the good is. So the idea is like, you can put, buy me a Lambo onto the list, but then you're the only person buying it. And so the information that you're the only person buying it itself tells the mechanism that like, hey, the matching ratio should be 0, right? But then if there's like something that everyone contributes to, then the matching ratio is much higher, right? It's like this economically beautiful idea, but then one of the challenges is that it's like it easily turns into a popularity contest, right? Basically, the cost to each person of like actually making the judgment of how valuable something is pretty high, and it turns out that like you basically win by just doing a really good job of campaigning and making more people aware of your thing than of other people's things, and then they just like throw in $5 without thinking too much, right? And so there have been a lot of more recent ideas to try to deal with that, and then one idea that I'm doing with Gitcoin is, actually got announced a few days ago, is deep funding, which basically says that you have a human jury which is like good at analyzing a few random specific questions of specific issues. So like for example, was thing A or thing B more important to the development of thing C, right? Some like very local question within an individual project. And then you create a graph of all of these kind of dependencies, like what is responsible for what to what degree. And then you have this open market where anyone can use AI or really arbitrary methods to just fill in all of the edges of the graph. Like I think in the first one, it's like going to be 40,000, but eventually like many millions, right? And then you use the human judges to like basically check in a few random positions, and the AI submissions that are the best at those random positions are what those are the numbers that you use for the rest of the values, right? And so it's this combination of info finance and public goods funding. So like to me, these things are potentially like institutional building blocks of the 21st century, right? Like they solve these really important problems that are just super critical in this like very digital world, and they solve them in a way that tries to minimize reliance on single centralized actors to just run everything and have power over everything. And I think communities like ours can be really powerful in actually trying out these ideas and really refining them and getting them to the point where they can be used everywhere else too.
In violent agreement with what you just mentioned. Let's dig into that first category you mentioned also, though, the kind of like basic finance building blocks. A lot of us here in this movement are working on those because those are ones where Argentina can greatly benefit from leapfrogging the current conditions here. There aren't a large number of mortgages, for an example, right? Like, it's like a basic building block in a lot of other places. It's kind of missing here. Access to like a non-inflating currency was like still is not quite there yet, right? Like it's still like a missing piece. There's a lot of other kind of critical building blocks. When you think about modern macroeconomic economies, what are the sets of things that you think are important to have, and what are the things that you see crypto as being able to like provide better than the old systems that might serve as inspiration for the folks here?
Yeah, so first of all, like things that crypto does well already. I mean, international payments is like a really important one, right? And I know for me personally, like I do a lot of international donations, right? And the places where money can do the most good are often scattered in pretty far-flung places across the world. And crypto is just an incredibly efficient payment rail. Money goes over immediately. Don't have to do complicated bank wiring, wait a long time, suffer high fees. And like it just works, right? So that's something that I've definitely experienced personally. And then also just ability to just hold savings and put them into different kinds of investments. So like those are the basics. And consumer payments, I think, is like one that we've wanted to do for a long time. But like I remember even back in 2013, right? There was this district in Berlin where there was one person who made a point of convincing like a dozen shops, actually even several dozen, like a dozen restaurants and others, and then more shops in a particular region to all accept Bitcoin. And he basically created this Bitcoin district in Berlin, right? And I think that dream ended up at least like temporarily suffering a big setback because basically fees went up, right? But now those problems are solved, and so I think it's worth really trying to come back to a lot of those ideas and try a lot of those things again. So look, just making basic payments work is valuable. Also, one other very particular area is how to provide safety for people's funds in a way that protects them against both centralized actors and against their own mistakes, right? So, like for a long time in our space, right, we've basically had two schools of thought of how to store your money, and one of those schools of thought is basically, you have all of your money in your own 12-word seed phrase, and you have to keep your 12-word seed phrase really, really safe. And then you put a backup of it, inside a brick, and then you put the brick inside of another brick, a box of titanium. You put that box like 19 feet underground, or I guess, here we use metric, fortunately, 19 meters underground. It's just something that's like very appealing to a certain type of nerd hobbyist, but it's just like non-viable for almost all of the population, right? And then a lot of people see this kind of advice and they just like give up and say, okay, I can't do this. I'm just going to trust someone to hold my money. And then a lot of the time that works, but then sometimes they choose to trust someone like Mt. Gox or like FTX, and then their money disappears completely, right? And there is a better approach that avoids the problems of both of those extremes, which is basically some form of multi-sig wallet, right? You have multiple keys, and some of those keys can be controlled by you, some of those keys can be controlled by other people, some of those keys, this is a very recent thing, instead of being keys, they can be zero-knowledge proofs of Web2 accounts. Could be corporate, could be government ID, right? So there's something called ZK email, which is like an account that you can only control if you make a zero-knowledge proof that you control an email account. There is Anon Adhar, which uses the Indian government ID, but makes a zero-knowledge proof that you have a particular Indian government ID without revealing which one. And so there's like a lot of these for like all, like both corporate and government, like trust points, all around the world, right? And you can basically have an account where you can, like your security can be any combination of these different things, right? And so you can, if you want to trust just your own keys, you can do that. If you want to trust other people, you can split the trust between different people. You can split it between different institutions. I mean, you could even say like, choose an email that's American, and then choose some social app that's Chinese, and then choose some government thing that's Argentinian, and you basically have something that's like very distributed. Like you have a lot of choice, right? And then the challenge is like, can we make that choice accessible to people in a way that has friendly UX? And I think we're getting there. Like we could get to the point where it's just like literally like a drag and drop, and like you put an email address here, you put an ETH address here, and you just like choose what you want, and like that's automatically how like recovery for your account works. So I think basically the problem of how to store your funds in a way that avoids dependence on a centralized actor, but at the same time doesn't require people to have an extreme amount of technical knowledge, and also never have their house burned down, never accidentally forget something, is like an important problem, but we're getting very far towards solving it. I mean, like this kind of structure is exactly what I store all of my like ETH in already.
What about structures for an economy like things that can help the formation of corporations, right? Or we've gotten DAOs, but in the original DAOs paper it was also DACs. We don't yet have decentralized autonomous corporations. People here, in order to incorporate a company, like that's a huge amount of effort and cost and so on, and you end up in a structure and jurisdiction that are harder than, say, if you did that in Dubai or in Singapore or the US. And so, I don't know, like from a broader economy finance perspective, like how do we like unlock massive economic growth using the financial rails of crypto?
Right. Yeah, and so first of all, I think like making real world assets accessible through crypto rails is super valuable in itself, right? And I know like MakerDAO has been doing a lot of things around that. There's been a lot of like individual projects that are trying to make wrappers of individual assets. It's a super valuable thing. And like if you can make all kinds of assets, not even just stocks, I mean even things that don't really exist in the modern world, like fractionalized real estate, like that's something that could be super powerful, right? Then like you don't even have to replicate access to tools that exist in the US. You can even like start inventing new tools, right? I think for corporations, the challenge is always, there's a couple of challenges, right? One is that on the governance side, right, I think a lot of the time when people do governance, they basically say like, oh, there's like a group of people or coins or something and like 51% can do something, right? But then the challenge is like if 51% can do anything, then 51% can basically like steal all of the resources from the other 49% and like that just breaks the system, right? And in the real world, we solve this kind of problem with like laws, right? And like a lot of those kinds of attacks are explicitly illegal to do. And in the crypto world, the question is like, can structures be long-term stable without relying on that, or ultimately, can you actually do something that is like, could you actually, like bring in some kind of legal protection into
We have LLMs now. It could be judges on chain.
Right, possibly. Yeah, I mean, Kleros, I think, is one of those local projects too. I think we have a lot of tools. I would definitely be like hesitant before just like directly saying an LLM controls a key. That's like we have.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, it's I think there was this experiment recently where someone put some money into a bot that where there was like basically the bot was given explicit instructions to not give the money to anyone, and then eventually someone figured out, it was a fun game. Basically, it's like in order to try to get the bot, to convince the bot to give you the money, you have to like put in a little more money, and so the bot grows over time as people fail, and eventually someone figured out how to convince the bot to give you the money, and you got like $48,000. So this is like one of those reasons, reasons why this kind of info finance approach of basically the bot is the engine and a non-market human judging mechanism is the steering wheel is like an approach that I'm excited about, right? And then the bots are incentivized to train to try to match that signal as much as possible, right? But you're also not trusting everything to them directly. There's like a check and balance. There's a lot of things you can do. And then the other big one is for corporations to do things, corporations need to be able to enter contracts. They need to be able to have real world assets. They need to have be able to have some kind of long-term legal certainty around all kinds of things, and that requires some kind of explicit support from the jurisdiction. Even just as one example, right? If you zero in on it, I think it's always good to zero in on specific examples. Let's take an example of can we do Aleph as a DAO, right? And the challenge here is, Aleph, it needs to get a space. And it needs to make a rental agreement, right? Or either buy the space or have a rental agreement. Then that's, the first is land ownership, the second is a legal contract. And so a DAO needs to somehow be able to sign that, right? So then how do you do that, right? So that's probably the biggest piece that you would have to solve. And then second piece you have to solve is how the actual governance works. And can you create something that makes high quality decisions, but also doesn't makes decisions that are representative of the community. If you just say, oh, Aleph has a token and anyone can go buy the token, that actually doesn't work really well, right? I think people kind of think that token-based DAOs work, they have this sort of legitimacy by having been there for a long time, and the reality is a lot of them basically only don't break because they're centralized and the tokens are held by 5 people, right? And then you see problems only 3% of people actually vote, so they end up being easy to capture. People just forget and they throw all their coins into delegators, and then you have delegator capture. And there's a lot of things that are very imperfect in there, right? So improving on that, then connection to the real world. Then there's interesting physical infrastructure you can do, for someone to be able to enter the space, that's something that you could enforce cryptographically. that part's actually fairly easy to do. Yeah, so I think this is one of those reasons why I think network states could be valuable. Like, they could actually be the first trial of using like blockchain rails to actually do real economy stuff and like actually pioneer all of that stuff. Figure out how to fight the bears, both metaphorical bears and metaphorical crypto bears. So except prices are going alongside.
Did you go walk into here by scanning your Corp ID ZK credential?
I did not.
Security seems lax. Actually, the UX needs improvement first.
It does. I mean, but it can improve quickly, right? I remember in Zurzalo we had the QR code, the ZooPass QR code, the zero knowledge proof to sign in, right? And like in the first week, the UX was total crap, right? Like you have to open a web page, and the web page sometimes loads, sometimes doesn't. You have to wait 20 seconds to generate a proof, and there's other things. And then by week 7, the UX is like actually quite good, right?
Please wait 5 minutes to enter the bathroom.
Bathrooms are fun. Maybe we should like do like AMM curves for bathrooms.
Let's talk about Argentina for a while. So for me, like when I look at over the last 100 years, Argentina started at the top of the world. It was like one of the top 10 countries by GDP at the beginning of the 20th century. So 1900 was one of the top 10. And then a whole range of economic mismanagement decisions plunged the country lower and lower and lower. There were periods of recovery and then like plunging lower. There's been like this pendulum swinging between like a lot of effort to right the ship and like do the right thing, and then it getting pulled back in another direction. I think there's the last 10, 15 years, there's been this really terrible inflation that eroded just so much of people's value and a bit interest in working. Like you could work really hard to get a high salary or not, and if you do that, then most of your value is going to be eroded away. So like, what's the point? Like, there's just a really hard kind of global incentive problem. And in last year, there's fed up with this. Argentinians decided to change this and ended up like Milei, who like just basically ran on enough. Let's change this. Let's change the entire structure. And that was a very surprising thing to also the people here, right? Like it was unknown until the very last moment in the election of kind of what was going to happen. And so today, almost a year in, inflation is down significantly, but we also need to the economy is hurting. It's going to hurt, and so there needs to be financial improvements. The jobs need to be created. Like a lot of work needs to be done. There's a lot of value that needs to be created in the coming 2-3 years to turn this kind of like opportunity into a success. What are the things that you've been coming to Argentina for a few years now? What are the things that you have seen from afar in this? Like what are you excited and optimistic about? Like what is kind of like your thoughts and recommendations for the people here to like take advantage of this opportunity?
I mean, the thing that I noticed even on the first visit, right, was that the economic situation was very challenging, but there was this really strong and really dedicated crypto community here, and people were like not even just using and building, but like excited about doing it. There was a lot of spirit, like a lot of will to try to like actually build something better, and like the phrase I used to describe Argentina then was low state capacity, high people capacity, right? And like one thing that you find is that countries in that position are exactly the countries where crypto tends to be most easily successful. So at the time, there was a lot of interest in like just crypto, but basically just like trading on and like using stable coins and like doing things on Binance, right? And there was ads for crypto everywhere, even in the airport. And now it feels like there's somewhat less of that. Like it feels like the level of attention on the street is like somewhat lower, but at the same time, the number of people building things is like much higher, right? And it feels like now there's both people with that drive to really get build and improve, and also the support from the top. And that combination seems extremely promising. So I guess, like the most important thing is to just take advantage of this opportunity, and I think there is a chance to like actually use a lot of those tools and like basically leapfrog the rest of the world on social and economic infrastructure.
If you were sitting in this room, or what are some of the things that you think the people here should do? Like there's 2 to 3 years of opportunity here. Like what would you orient people towards?
I mean, so one is just ongoing improvement in the payments and finance. And I think there's a big part of the problem is a local, which is basically on-ramps and off-ramps, right? And it's not just an Argentina problem, right? I think it's also important to think of it from the lens of the LATAM economy, the global economy, connections between Argentina and the U.S. and Europe. A lot of international business, on-ramps and off-ramps are one of those really big challenges. Like, there's just a lot of basic stuff that needs to work well for crypto to actually be effective for people. So I think that's one side of things. And then the other side, and I think the other side is like all of the different categories that we talked about here, and I think all of the categories that the rest of the world is doing, like all of that is absolutely open to Argentinians, including public goods funding, including info finance, including experimenting in governance. All of those things are very open to people here. And I think the big next step for the Ethereum in general is to take a lot of these ideas and really move them into large-scale reality. And I think here the opportunity is basically that there's like fewer like stable economic structures that exist to the same extent. And so for building a new thing, like it actually makes sense to try to see can you build that new thing using all of these crypto tools that we have.
So what does it mean to build a new thing, right? So like there's the discovery of a new primitive and so on. I mean, you can talk about it, but like how do you go from an idea to suddenly you have millions of people using it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is always one of the hardest parts, right? Is like by default, if you just build a thing, like it's not true that people just come on it, right? By default, people have no idea if your thing can be trusted. They have no idea if anyone else is already using your thing. We don't have network effects. Like it's actually challenging, and especially in this space, the type of things that we're building are inherently about coordination, right? So I think there's a couple of different paths that you can take, right? So one of them is like for someone joining a community, like I think it's underrated to try to become established in the community and known in the community first, and then try to build things. This is the path that I took, right? Like I think people only cared enough about Ethereum to learn about it because for 2 years before that I'd been a writer for Bitcoin magazine and people already knew about me from my writing, right? So that's one thing. Also just like learning and like getting up to date with both crypto things, but also just everything else that's happening in the world of technology. So AIs, interfaces, computer hardware, like the whole spectrum of things, right? Just building things, even if those things don't get users, is a powerful educational opportunity. So getting enough skill and getting enough community recognition that you can actually get to that next step, I think is, it's always like the first step that you need to take, right? And then another step, another thing that you can do is like first to join an existing project, right? There's a lot of projects, and if there's one that's doing something that you are personally excited about, then like actually go and join it, right? Then once you get to the step of like actually building the next thing, I think things like very abstract, right? So if you think about like walking backwards, like 10 things even outside of crypto that have been significant changes to the internet, right? So obviously one is all of the different AI tools. And there's LLMs, there's like text and video, there's all of the different creative tools that are based on like image and video and audio AI. then different form factors of social media. So like you're not going to make the next Twitter by replicating Twitter. You're going to make the next Twitter by creating something that gives people something that Twitter does not give them. So like Twitter did not win by trying to be the next Facebook. TikTok did not win by trying to be the next Twitter. Facebook did not win by trying to be the next MySpace, right? Like you need to create a new form factor. Then another one of those like questions that I ask myself is like I have a 3-factor test, right? One factor is can I imagine like myself, or at least myself, in a different situation using the thing. 2, can I imagine myself or someone being willing to pay for the thing? And 3, can I imagine myself being excited about the thing existing even if I'm not part of making it happen and benefiting from the outside? Like I think something that's really valuable needs to pass all three of those tests, right? If it fails the first, then it's like an idealistic idea that's useless. If it fails the second, then it's not monetizable and you just get stuck and you can never get it to a high enough level of quality. And then if it fails the third, then like, okay, maybe like you're making a meme coin casino, or you're making like the next big thing where you get to be excited about being a main character, but then like, are you actually making the world better? Like it's not clear, right? And like you want something that I think really gets like 3 out of 3 at the same time, right? And like, it can contain memes, so like it probably should be fun. It can monetization, it can contain coins. There's a lot of different strategies to monetize that I think are really underrated. I think combining together financial and non-financial pieces is really valuable, right? But like if you have an idea that feels like it passes those tests, then I would say just go for it.
What are some of the things that could employ millions of people, right? So things like the sharing economy ended up creating massive amounts of jobs, but we haven't quite seen sharing economy type things as much in the crypto space. Like there's of course crypto mining, right? Like you go and set up your own, like a DeFi network sort of works, but we haven't seen this for ride sharing or for tasks or things like that. Could those finally work now, or are there other ways that you think of which we could create like millions of jobs?
Yeah, I mean the closest thing that we've had to that kind of success is the play to earn stuff, right? And like that has legitimately made a lot of money for people. Like if you go into Vietnam, Philippines, even here, there's a lot of people whose experience with crypto actually is like, hey, I discovered that like I could just play inside of this game or for a period of time earn like $440 a month, and that's like crazy meaningful to them, right? So like that it exists, though at the same time it's like less obviously not very sustainable, right? It depends on like games having speculative dynamics. I think the challenge is like we're in a faster moving economy and like just faster technological progress, and so it's hard to even come up with a particular form factor that's we can be confident will be stable for a very long time, right? Like we've had ride sharing, and now the self-driving cars are starting to come in, and I'm predicting that we're going to see like a loop of relatively shorter term things, and we have to just keep creating new ones, right? And I think what I would want to see is like that kind of loop for open source contributions, creative contributions, things on contributions to art, contributions to social media, even some of these like co-created virtual worlds. Then within the physical world, mining I think is like one of those things where like I think proof of work has gone as far as it can, but at the same time there's like all of these use cases of file storage, AI related computation, all kinds of different things, right? And a lot of them are like actually relatively accessible because they don't depend on like things being super well optimized, right? Like many types of computation to be useful, you have to be like 120 milliseconds away from the user, and if you're 110 milliseconds away, then you're like twice as useful, right? But like AI training is not like that, right? And like AI training actually is pretty close to being sort of mining-like in terms of how fungible it is. So I think we are going to see mining-like things happen there, and that's a growing space. What else? And it's a lot of the stuff is just hard to predict ahead of time, right? Like I did not predict play to earn.
Right, so I'm going to open to audience questions in a moment, so start thinking about your questions. And do we have another mic somewhere? Or are these the only two? Okay, these are the only two, so I'm going to give you my mic to go around. Use it wisely. And I'm going to ask just two more questions, and then I'm going to open up. So, maybe question one. So one of the things that Relay wants to do is get rid of some central banks, stop the printing, and ideally set up a structure that inhibits future governments from using the printing machine as much as it has in the past. From my perspective, crypto solves this. This is like where it came from. But so, how would you do that at a national level today? Like, what are some of the ideas? And maybe a second broader question version of that is like, what are the other things, if you were kind of redesigning Argentina's economy from scratch today for the 21st century, how would you design it? Like, what are the building blocks that you would put in?
Yeah, no, that first one is really fascinating, right? Like, you could totally make a central bank digital currency where you put in the mechanism for issuing it on chain, and you put like a hard rule that says, right in the smart contract, you're allowed to issue a maximum of like 7% new coins every year, right? And you just like stick that right there on the chain. And in order to get around it, like basically the government would have to like basically issue a new version and then get all of the different companies to update their software, point to a new version. And like they legally could do it, but it would just be like very obvious and very embarrassing, right? And like it would be a very big speed bump against them doing that. So if they wanted to do something like that, I think it definitely could be really cool. In terms of like, Argentinian economy more generally, there's other assets that I think are valuable to put on chain. Land is obviously a big one, right? And in general, digitizing land records is something that's valuable and good, and because it's like upstream of anything else that's interesting that you want to do with that. And the basic way that it's become much easier recently, right? Like there's specialized companies where what they do is they have AI tools that can read existing analog paper records, like basically dump all of your paper registries from everywhere, and at the same time they can use AI interpret satellite scans, and then they combine that information together, and they can get like a surprisingly accurate first pass digital registry, right? This is stuff that's actually being done in a lot of countries right now. And then on top of that, you can do things like fractionalizing it. You can potentially do all kinds of things to try to unlock its value, right? One of the things that I'm personally a fan of is land tax ideas, things that try to separate the value of the land from the value of structures on top of the land, right? And so the idea is basically if you build a structure on top of a piece of land, then that's something you did, and so 100% of the upside should be yours. But then if, on the other hand, you have some government projects that actually does something that improves the value of land in a whole community, then that's something that the government should be able to get upside from back. And so if you have a tax structure that only touches the land without touching the buildings, then you actually get both at the same time. And that becomes very easy to administer if everything is electronic. And then on top of that, if you combine, if you make things accessible to the chain, then any value that's in either land or buildings, you can fractionalize it. You can use it as collateral for various kinds of things. You can create completely new structures where people, instead of either having 0 homes and being negatively exposed to land, or having 1 home being very positively exposed to it, you can have a sliding scale and unlock the entire spectrum from 0 to 1. You can you have very powerful tools by which you can do a lot of things with land economics, both at the level of government policy and at the level of individuals doing things with individual lands that they own. Then, with companies, like if you have company registrations on chain, then you can use that. You can use that as collateral. You can use that as like attestations of that for all kinds of other purposes. Like a lot of things become possible.
All right, let's open up to folks. So I think you were first. Say your name and then your question.
Sophia, first of all, thank you for creating these changes that I so many people, especially here in Argentina. My question is regarding quantum computing. What are you thinking of? Because I understand that if we have like the right amount of qubits in the wrong hands, it's a disaster. Not only for like blockchain, but for everything. And what are the plans regarding that?
Okay, so first of all, what quantum computers, like when they work, can do, right? So quantum computers, they can break about half of the cryptography that blockchains use today. Specifically, they can break elliptic curves, they cannot break hashes. But for every single specific thing that quantum computers can break, we know of quantum-resistant alternatives. The reason we're not using them today is because realistically, they're like 3 to 10 times less efficient, right? But at some point, when quantum computers come, we have to switch to them because we have no choice. And basically, like, we lose about 5 years of Moore's law, and that's just something that we have to survive and move past, right? So my impression, like, if I had to guess, I would say quantum computers that are capable of actually breaking cryptography are maybe 10 to 15 years away. Could be less, could be more, very hard to estimate. And so, it is something that Ethereum needs to be ready for. And if we already have like a roadmap where for every single piece that is quantum vulnerable, like we know what we need to do in order to replace it with something that is quantum resistant, right? So for like BLS signatures in consensus, we plan to replace them with hash-based signatures that can be aggregated with Starks. For blobs that use for KZG, we plan to replace that with starking erasure-coded Merkle roots. For Merkle trees, there's a plan to just skip Merkle trees entirely and move to Stark proofs over binary hash trees. For signatures inside of user accounts, this is what account abstraction is for, so users can choose whatever like verification function they want, and so users can individually operate. Right, so for every piece, like there's a way to address it, and this is something that I personally am very confident that Ethereum will be able to do over the next like 5 to 7 years. And if we discover quantum computers are coming much faster, then we definitely have ways of increasing the priority.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to do 2 here and 2 here to batch a little bit. Thank you.
Hi, this is Tule from Simplify, and I have a questions about pop-up cities and network states. So the way that I see it, pop-up cities are organizations that aspire to become at some point network states. So my question is like, what are the tools that these organizations need in order to maximize the probability of going from pop-up city organizers to network states? Because currently they seem to be overly dependent on funding by either donors or institutions, and they're not like sustainable.
Yeah, okay, so I think one of the natural next steps for a lot of these is permanent locations. And I think permanent locations have a couple of important benefits, right? So one is that like a lot of people care about this goal of like having positive sum relationships with locals and like actually like engaging with the existing communities in different parts of the world. And I think that's just not realistically possible to do if you're just coming in for 42 days and then coming out, right? I think for that to happen at all, like you just need to have longer term engagement. Another reason is that like temporary accommodation is just fundamentally more expensive, and it's also like a big headache on organizing staff, and it's especially a big headache if you have like custom needs, right? Like if you care about having exercise space, then like you have to go and figure that out yourself. You have to have a team that does it, and like there's both people cost and there's just like raw like rental cost. And so permanent locations, I think, will will allow more engagement with local communities and will also decrease the cost by quite a bit. And I already know of like at least 3 or 4 different places that are moving to trying to do permanent locations. So I think that will start to continue to increase over time. Then I think from the, going forward from there, another thing is that pop-ups are okay, so when I was presenting about network states in Singapore, I had this diagram where I showed the San Francisco subway, right? In the San Francisco subway, you have 4 different lines, and while you're inside of downtown SF, the lines are all parallel to each other. They're the same line, right? But then as soon as you cross over into the East Bay, the lines completely diverge. They become 180-degree opposite directions from each other, right? And the analogy I used is that the beginning stages of basically you start with making a community, then you make a pop-up city. These are all the same for every possible end goal, but the end goals are different, right? So some people want to create a new jurisdiction. Some people want to help create a node that can lift up an existing jurisdiction. Some people want a monastery. Some people want a university, right? These are all valid goals. But once you get past the pop-up level, then you actually have to choose, right? And the choosing step is hard because a lot of the time you don't realize that you have people in your community with different goals, because up until that point, it looked like everyone's goals were aligned. Everyone is happy with being a community, everyone's happy with being a pop-up city, right? But then you actually have to make that choice. And from that point forward, the playbook actually does become different, right? And I think that's fine, and that's a healthy part of the growth of any community. But that's the other big thing that I think communities need to figure out and really start building around.
Over this side. Over there.
Hi, Vitalik. It's a pleasure to have you in Argentina again. I set up several Ethereum nodes and Bitcoin miners inside the central bank in Argentina. It's the first time in history. I want to invite everybody to visit that. It's going to be open until March. And cordially, we want to invite you. You can come to the central bank. Because I think it's a very important moment for Argentina. Everything that we are living in the country, and it will be great to have you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Juan Pablo. Recently, there has been some discussion about the future. Future of solidity. For efficiency reasons mostly. Do you think it will disappear? How long? It will be replaced by some Rust alternative? What do you think?
Okay, so I have not heard about people complaining about solidity for efficiency. Are you talking about the EVM?
Yeah, I heard that in DevCon there's some debate about that for solidity.
Okay, yes. No, because, again, I think it's important to distinguish between the EVM and Solidity, right? Solidity is a language that compiles to the EVM. There's also other languages like Viper. I encourage people to check out Viper. It's basically, it has Python-like syntax, and I've been using it lately. I think it's wonderful. But the efficiency, I think, of that layer is fine. The place where the efficiency is challenging is the EVM, right? And the way that I think about efficiency is I think about, generally in practice, computations that are intensive enough that you have to care about efficiency, they tend to be basically split into 2 parts. This is what I call the glue and the coprocessor, right? There's part of the computation that is very general purpose, but where there's actually not that much computation. And then there's computation that is intensive, but where the computation is doing very specific and very structured tasks, right? And my view is that the way that we can optimize the EVM is we can create specialized modules that do a much better job at doing those specialized tasks, right? So this is the reason why I've been a big fan of this EVM Max plus SIMD roadmap, right? Basically, you add an extra module to the EVM that's if people have done Python, it's basically the equivalent of NumPy, right? It's a module that can do modular operations for like different bit sizes going up to 768-bit. And two, it can, if you have lists of numbers, it can do operations on like those lists of numbers at the same time, right? And especially for lattices, starks, small field operations, like many kinds of cryptography, being able to do VM operations on lists of numbers at the same time, like that's the key thing that lets you get very close to like theoretically optimal efficiency, right? So that's something where I think if we have it, then like we'll be able to make the EVM very efficient, including for like really complicated things like cryptographic operations.
Thanks.
Right.
Hi, Vitalik. I'm Natishi from Think and Dev, and I read a developer report from Electrical Capital these days. A lot of discussion is around the amount of depth that each blockchain has, and I think that this metric is like a vanity metric in terms of showing growth, but maybe it's not showing value somehow, and it's valid for blockchains that are starting, but the discussion is like layer 2s are not part of Ethereum, so I want to know how do you think about this, and maybe which are the metrics or KPIs that we need to follow in order to start building more value and not being just comparing like number of developers, but start comparing the value size and how we are impacting in people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think, developers are definitely one metric. Like, I think there are like different specific metrics that you can look at, and like people have different ones. There's like devs, transactions, TVL, like all of these things, and like each of those metrics, they capture one thing, but they also don't capture like a full piece, right? Like a lot of the time, like the things that convince me the most that Ethereum is having an impact are not like generally not the things that are captured by those metrics at all, right? So like for example, like I'm excited about Polymarket this year. Why? Because I saw that like there was a big election happening, and this was like a real world event that huge numbers of people care about, and I saw how people in the mainstream, even non-crypto people, they were sharing screenshots of Polymarket, and this was like a big part of their information gathering process, right? Like actual specific non-crypto people that actually knew for non-crypto reasons, they were like actually using this application, and that application was like directly providing value to them, right? Well, like that's definitely something that's a lot more illegible than a metric. It's but like it's still a signal that you can kind of understand, right? Like basically, if you hear, like if you see evidence of people deriving value from something where you're getting that information through a channel that's not the crypto world, right? Like that means that you've actually, like it's actually gone full circle, and it's like actually escaped into the mainstream, and it's done something useful enough for people, right? So I think that's like a really like one of those things to watch. I mean, I think there have been a few examples of this. Like there have been examples of people using blockchains for censorship resistance, and like something like that's broken out past the crypto world. Also, Ukraine got accepted donations back in 2022, and like literally the national Twitter account was asking like. And that was like that's a very visible sign. Like here's crypto actually doing the job of being a financial system that works when all the other ones don't, right? So looking for instances of value being provided where you hear about those instances from a direction that's like totally not crypto is like the thing that I personally watch for.
Hello, my name is Levent. Thank you. So I am working at Zama, and you were talking about coprocessor. A bit of marketing, but we just released the coprocessor on FHE to outsource FHE computation. So it's nice. We want to do the same. And my question is, do you think it's truly possible to make significant progress in bringing institutions on chain without addressing confidentiality? And also, do you think about the confidentiality layer for Ethereum in the long term?
Yeah, no, I think like privacy is going to be super important, and like I've definitely been like heavily supporting all of the work that's been done on ZK snarks for that, and like we're actually starting to see, I mean, both like things like Railway and also the institutional work that's being done by people like EY for the last few years. So I think that's been good. And it's definitely going to be interesting to see like what are the extra things on top of that FHE is going to provide. And I think yeah, these are definitely very important topics.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, Vitalik. I'm Brenda. Latin American community, as you call it, inside Latin, has the opportunity to have one of the community hub in DevCon, the world of this side. So my question for you is, what do you think about this side? What are your thoughts about this side? And what do you think that is going to happen in the future with this side?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the DSI is like a space that has a lot of potential. I think the thing that I'm like looking to judge is basically like what is the specific problem that a DSI project is trying to solve, and is it actually like does the tool match the job, right? And like is the tool uniquely positioned to do a much better job? And so the things that we've seen are, I mean, one is obviously just using coins and tokens and like various investment mechanisms to make it easier for people to invest in science. And like, to me, that's good, but it's also kind of limiting, right? Because like one of the reasons is that a lot of us were in crypto because we care about open source, and like some DeFi projects are basically saying, okay, we're going to fractionalize the IP, but at the end of the day, like it's still IP and it still has all of the same problems that IP has, right? And if we can actually like use our ability to make economic mechanisms that try to like raise money in a way that like mitigates the downsides of IP, like for me personally, that's something that's more interesting. Another interesting, I think, aside from bringing in money, the other thing that it can do is like bring in attention, right? And bring in participation, decentralized trials. Like, I think that's all valuable. Like, I definitely think there's a lot of these really interesting clusters. Also, like incentive-based mechanisms to replace the function of peer review, like basically identifying places where you might need to, well, where a study might or might not replicate. Like, there's a lot of these info finance problems that could be solved. So I think there's like a huge number of these valuable niches, but I think it's like really important to judge each project individually and like ask what's the problem that it's solving, and like is it uniquely suited to solve that problem, and like does it do a good job of like actually encouraging like value and attention to flow to more valuable things over less valuable things.
All right, last two questions. Make them good ones.
Hi, Vitalik. One question related to the future of Ethereum that you mentioned many times. Related to use snarks in the consensus. What's your point of view related on, for example, Ethereum in maybe 10 years being greedy enough and really algorithmically, I say, in order to conquer all the internet and the communication. So that's possible view, like using in the communication like the mobile phone, etc. What's your point of view?
Sorry, I'm not understanding. You mean?
Yeah. So my question is, when we change the consensus using snarks,
Okay.
and you achieve all the roadmap,
Okay.
what will be the future of Ethereum in terms of communications, in terms of other user cases?
What do you mean in communications?
Communication, it means you see it in your phone, having validators, phone, systems.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there's like two questions, right? One is like, what kinds of technical properties it will have, and the other is like what that translates to in terms of use cases. So I think for technical properties, like high scalability, like stronger L1, much stronger L2, also faster consensus, something that's like very simple, that's very reliable, that's very robust and safe. I think, and then also making staking as decentralized as possible. I think these are all things that we can do. And so that's one part. And the other part is enabling applications, right? And I think they are like, to me, scalability and improving, transaction times continuing to decrease a little bit more, and like some of the account abstraction technology giving users more choice and more flexibility in how accounts work. I think those are like the three things that will translate into improving the experience for people building things and using things on the chain the most, and like different like that means different things for different users, right? But like generally, if the infrastructure becomes like much cheaper and much easier to use, then it'll have like positive effects for any application.
Yes, I have another question more on a personal level to both of you. You've known each other for many years now, I think even more than 10. And 11, so more than 10. And I heard both of you talking about each other in several occasions. Did you imagine when you were having those first beers or teas together that you would be 11 years afterwards in the middle of Buenos Aires talking about transforming a country using crypto?
Again, at the time I was in the early, like when I first met Juan at a group house in San Francisco, I was in the early stages, like maybe mid stages of writing the original Ethereum roadmap. And at the time, I thought that Ethereum was something that I would just like go work on, get out there in a few months, and then go back to university. So the answer is no, I did not expect anything else of what happened. How about you? What were you expecting back in 2013?
Great question. So that house was a very special place where a lot of projects got their start. Lots of really cool things happened in these kinds of group houses. I think a lot of us then were talking about many of the things that today kind of run the world. We were talking about, hey, AGI is going to come soon. Hey, self-driving cars and robotics are like around the corner-ish. Hey, Bitcoin is this like really interesting thing. And so I don't think any of us expected to be in the middle of Buenos Aires talking about like changing the macroeconomy of the world. But I think enough of us had seen the last few decades of change and had seen many stories of people building things that ended up changing the world. And certainly a lot of us in that house, and in many other houses like it, were doing things because we wanted to achieve that like long-term sort of change. So it's very difficult to know how things are going to turn out. But if you really, really, really care about having a large-scale positive impact, you can predict a lot of that future. And if you focus hard on it over year over year, decade over decade, you can move mountains. I think Sam Altman has this very good observation where it's sometimes like easy to underestimate how much massive change you can have in 10 years alone if you develop a long-term plan and just hyper-focus on it. So I think you can do a lot. As Steve and many other people have talked about, it's very difficult to connect the dots looking forward. You can only really connect the dots looking back. And for all of the people here, I'm super excited to see what you are going to go on to build. So with that, Vitalik, thank you so much for being here with us and for sharing these last couple of hours with us. A huge round of applause. Invite you to take a break, and this is the rest of the agenda after. I think we're starting with, I guess, that talk at 16:30? Great. So at 16:30, talk back here, hang out.